What happens when the core values of democracy are tested? Not by external threats, but from within. The answers may lie in history. This is Global Insights.
From a historical perspective, the fact that many countries that made transitions have not done so well, that is not, in fact, surprising.
30 years after Francis Fukuyama wrote about the triumph of liberal democracy, it's clear that illiberalism remains a pressing concern in the 21st century. What's less clear is how we should interpret this illiberal wave sweeping across the world.
People have sorted themselves into political parties that are much more homogenous in some ways, particularly on the Republican side, than they were in the past.
In this archived episode, we were joined by Sheri Berman, a professor of political science at Barnard College, Columbia University, and author of Democracy and Dictatorship in Europe, From the Ancient Regime to the Present Day. How should we interpret the current wave of liberalism sweeping across Europe, the United States, and the rest of the world? And how can history help us make sense of it? Moderating the discussion is Courtney Doggett, president of Network 2020.
So to begin, I want to start off with a little bit about terminology, just because I think that there are a lot of words that get thrown around without entirely understanding what their precise definitions are, whether it's, talking about illiberalism and governance, hybrid regime, virtual democracy, electoral democracy, Freedom House has partly free. And then similarly, democracy has many different names and stages, from liberal democracy to a liberal democracy. So when you're looking at the scope of words and terms used to describe your work and your research, what do you think is most important for people to know? And what are there clear dividing lines?
So that's a great question. It's always good to sort of start off conversations about what's going on by making sure that we all understand that we're talking about the same things. So as a historically minded political scientist, let me take your question first by stepping back a little bit. So if we were to sort of parachute down into the political world just before the third wave of democracy began, which was in the 70s with the transitions to democracy in Southern Europe, then the wave continues to Latin America, Soviet Empire, yada, yada, yada. So if we were to look at the political world before that, what we would have seen is that the most common type of regime that existed in the world is something that political scientists often refer to as closed autocracy. So those are very repressive regimes where there's no real elections. Individual citizens have very few rights. Repression is a pretty standard tool of governance. So think of, the regimes that existed in the Soviet Empire, military dictatorships in Latin America, things like that. So again, in the early 70s, before this huge wave of democracy, that was the most common type of regime that existed in the world. Now, there were also obviously democracies. Those would be heavily concentrated, obviously, in North America and Western Europe. So the world was much simpler before this most recent wave of political change happened. You essentially would be right if you guessed, nasty repressive dictatorship or fairly well-functioning democracy. Now, we had a huge number of regime changes that began in the 1970s, as I said, Southern Europe, Latin America, and then, of course, the huge wave of democratizations that occurs with the collapse of the Soviet Empire. Now, when we look around the world today, it's much messier. It's much less clear-cut, in a way, than the world of the Cold War, the pre-third wave world was. Why? Well, we have a lot of regimes that are sort of democratic, right? Relatively well-functioning, still North America and Western Europe. But now we've got a lot of regimes that kind of mix things, right? That sort of have elections. They're not really free and fair. And citizens are much freer, certainly, than they would have been under dictatorships, military dictatorships in Latin America, communist dictatorships in Central Asia, Russia, Eastern Europe, but clearly not as free their leaders not as subject to electoral recall as, we think of in democracies in Western Europe and North America. So we have now a whole variety of what are sort of in-between regime types. So now people talk about liberal democracies. Those are democracies that combine the features of liberalism and democracy. I can talk more about why those two things should not be conflated. We have some regimes that people refer to as electoral democracies. Okay, they're elections, they're relatively free and fair, but the liberal aspects of democracy are not fully there. Separation of powers, independent courts, minority and individual rights are fully protected, things like that. Now, interestingly today, this is a long-winded answer. Interestingly today, the most common regime type that we have in the world, if you think of what political scientists how political scientists analyze these things, is something that's called an electoral autocracy. And this was very uncommon before the third wave. An electoral autocracy seems like a contradiction in terms, but what it is a regime where there are elections, but they're not really free and fair. That is to say, there are oppositions, there's some civil society, citizens have the right to vote, they're not overly surveilled or subject to overt violence as they would have been in the 1970s. But those elections, the oppositions are really hindered in some very significant ways. So if you think about countries like Turkey, Hungary, India today, those are countries, again, those are electoral autocracies. And if you were to, again, to sort of parachute down into the world from an alien planet, that would be the regime type that is now most common. And so it's this kind of weird mixed regime. We still have closed autocracies. We have the China, which is much more autocratic even than it was 10 years ago. And of course, the crazy places like North Korea and military dictatorships that still exist. But these electoral autocracies that kind of combine a little bit of different things, these are now the most common regime type. And so it is actually confusing when you look at the world, because sometimes it's kind of difficult to know, what you're looking at. In 1970, you would have known this is a democracy, this is a dictatorship. Today, we've got a lot of betwixt in between.
Thank you. And that explains why it's so easy to mix up those terminologies. So thank you for setting us straight. Last year, you wrote that in recent years, democracy has been under siege. Since 2015, the number of countries that have been experiencing democratic backsliding has outstripped the numbers of those that are democratizing. So looking back, when did, and you started to touch on this a little bit, but when did liberal democracy become the norm? And then how did we get to this age of autocratization?
Okay, so that's another great question. So as I mentioned already, and as I'm sure most of your participants are aware since they're here, we had this wave of democracy that begins to sweep across the globe in the middle of the 1970s, again, Southern Europe, Latin America, and then the big shift, which comes with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Soviet Empire. The only part of the world that is really immune to that wave is the Middle East, right, which has its own very brief springtime of the peoples in, the 2010 period, but otherwise is the only area of the world that doesn't fall under this democratic wave. So if you were to look at the number of democracies that existed across the globe, right, it goes up until about 2010, and then it begins to level off. So today, you have more countries that are moving backwards, that is to say, that are moving from the democratic away from the democratic category towards the autocratic category. It doesn't mean they're there yet, but it means they are becoming, the characteristics of democracy are becoming fewer, weaker, that kind of thing. Now, so we have an undertow, which makes perfect sense because we use the term wave for a reason, right? The imagery that's supposed to bring up in your mind is obviously, okay, it's January in New York, but still we can all imagine a beach. A wave is a huge movement, right, of particles, water particles, whatever, going together, cresting up, in this case, in the democratic category, but there has to be an undertow. And historically, all other waves of democratization have been followed by an undertow. So from a historical perspective, the fact that many countries that made transitions have not done so well, that is not, in fact, surprising. So if you're a historian historically minded, you would have expected the undertow for reasons that we can discuss. And there surely has been one. And again, from 2010 on, we've had more countries moving backwards, if you want to use a sort of teleological perspective, than moving into the democratic category. That said, I think it is still very important to note that if you're just looking at numbers, or for that matter, even population percentages, we still obviously have many more countries that are democratic, more people living on democracies in 2022, surely than we did before the third wave, but we're back to the levels of about, the late 1990s. That is to say, after the collapse of the Soviet Empire, but not, with the further parts of that wave that, go again up into the early part of the 21st century. So we're definitely in a period where the undertow now is stronger than the wave itself, but historically, we are still, in a comparative perspective, much more democratic of a globe than we've been at any time in the past, with the exception of the height of this wave, like I said, which is about 2010.
Thank you. You mentioned, you started to touch on history, and so I wanted to talk about your book a little bit. It's extremely well researched. I mean, you're going, way into a lot of different developments that happened on the continent. And I assume that it's one, because you're a professor of history, and so this is something that's very interesting to you, but I also assume that there's another reason to do it. And so why do we need to understand this history of democratic development? And conversely, what is the risk of not understanding that?
So I'm actually a political scientist, not a historian. The historians would be very upset, but that's fine. I'm a historian, not a political scientist. That's fine. So why do it this way? Well, first of all, I think that history provides us with a really crucial, essential perspective on understanding the present day. And if we're just going to think about this from a democratic perspective, right, I think that's clear. I already mentioned one important thing that we should recognize, right? Which is waves have undertows. So while we should be saddened by the fact that there are countries moving away from democracy, we should not be surprised. Okay. So, if anybody remembers their history, 1918, 1945, 1848, these were all previous waves of democracy, right? If you looked at the world in 1918 or 1945 or in 1848, you would be incredibly optimistic. Oh my goodness, dictatorships are falling, new democracies emerging, this is great, right? And then if you sort of plopped yourself down, some years later, you'd be depressed as all heck. Why? Because many of those new democracies failed, right? So on the one hand, right, just from the perspective of democracy, we should not be surprised by the undertow. But from a deeper causal perspective, right, why is it that there are undertows? It's not just saying that history repeats itself is not, it may be valuable, but it's superficial, right? So if you see a historical pattern, the next thing that you should be doing is looking for the reasons for that pattern. Does it exist? Are there causal reasons for that pattern to exist? And surely there are. Why? Because despite the way it appears initially, overthrowing dictatorships turns out to be a lot easier than building democracies, right? And so, when you see a dictatorship, you're thinking, oh my God, this is sturdy. It has control of an immense repressive surveillance apparatus. The opposition is divided and weak, and you think, how is it going to disappear? And these are true things, but again, it is easier to get rid of these dictatorships than it is to build a democracy, because a democracy requires a whole range of institutional and normative infrastructure to work. And so the reason why there are undertows is because many of the countries that manage to overthrow dictatorships don't have the necessary institutional, normative, and other preconditions to make democracy work. And so the reason why I wrote the book this way, or one reason why I wrote this book this way, and one reason why I think even if you're a political scientist interested in the present day, you need to understand history, is it's very difficult to know what should surprise you and what shouldn't, where you should be looking for causal relationships, and where things are just spurious, right? So we know there are undertows. So what should we be looking for? Which are the countries where we would most likely expect to see decay? Why are the reasons why we use this, or people have used this term wave, precisely because you understand in retrospect, right? You don't see it at the time, but in retrospect, overthrowing those dictatorships turns out to be the first step on a very long and difficult path. It's not the end of the story, it's the beginning. And if you don't know history, you won't recognize that pattern, and you won't know to look for the reasons for why those patterns exist.
So then, jumping off that point, how do well-functioning democracies emerge and thrive? And what circumstances facilitate the rise of illiberal practices within these democracies?
So that's a huge question, and one on about which probably hundreds, thousands of books and even more articles have been written. So I mean, I'll throw out some things to think about, but that's an impossible. It's a really difficult. It's the important question, right? So I already mentioned that democracy requires a whole range of institutional and normative preconditions. I think most people recognize that when they think about it. Okay, so what does that mean? We need, whatever, separation of powers, well-functioning courts, rule of law, civilian control of the military, norms of political equality, right? Democracy does not require all citizens be economically equal. That may be desirable depending on your political viewpoint, but you do need to accept that everyone who is a member of your national community has the same political rights and responsibilities. You need to accept that leaders are responsive to citizens. Elites in society have to recognize that they are there to act as public servants, not as sort of separate entities who have a right to power separate from their representative function. So all of those things are necessary. They're not sufficient, and they are not easy things to construct. Beyond that, there are a whole range of societal and economic conditions or variables that social scientists point to, right? So, one thing that we're debating a lot today in the West, in the United States, is how much economic inequality is consistent with the political equality that is a necessity for democracy, right? Again, democracy does not require equality of income, but it does require that economic resources not be translated into political ones, right? So citizens must be politically equal, right? Okay, how to interpret that is not necessarily clear, but you can have economic resources translated into political resources, right? And so questions of economic equality and economic conditions also affect the functioning of democracy. Similarly, social conditions, right? Where you cannot have political equality in a society that is extremely socially stratified. Why? Again, because political equality is necessary for democracy. And if social status translates, again, directly into political resources, you're not dealing with democratic conditions. So all of these things need to be there to make democracy work well, right? To have, and we may want to talk a little bit more about this term, a really well-functioning liberal democracy, right? And so, having all of those things, constructing all of those things, developing all of those things, that is a lot, right? And it took in the West, hundreds of years for that to happen, right? If we think about, the European case, which is the one that my book is about, right? Our first real attempt at democracy in Europe, the start of the modern political era, is the French Revolution, right? 1789. France, much less Europe, doesn't get a really stable, well-functioning democracy until the Fifth Republic, right? It's called the Fifth Republic because, there were 4 tries before that. And if you know anything about French history, even that number does not sufficiently capture the amount of, conflict and chaos that characterizes France from 1789 up through the post-war era. The United States, we think of as being a democracy from its origins, but of course, comparatively, that is not true. I mean, we had a civil war up through that point. Obviously, a significant part of our country is an oligarchic aristocracy. It is not a democracy. And up until the Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s, a significant percentage of American citizens were denied full political equality, were denied their democratic rights. And so the United States also cannot be considered a full, well-functioning liberal democracy up through, at the very least, the 1960s. So, again, taking that earlier question, history is important, right? It makes us understand how long, how hard, how difficult that road to democracy is. And therefore, when we look at countries that made transitions in the late 20th, early 21st century, who've not had democratic experience in the past, and we think, oh my goodness, look how messed up they are. Well, I mean, again, if you parachuted yourself into France 20 years after the French Revolution, things were kind of messy. So again, it takes a lot to make democracy work, a lot.
At Global Insights, we're committed to providing you with thought-provoking content and insights that matter. We're a nonprofit organization, and our mission is made possible through the support of listeners like you. If you've been enjoying the discussions and perspectives we bring you, we kindly invite you to be a part of our mission. Visit network2020.org for more info. From all of us, thank you.
I want to kind of keep chipping away at it in a slightly different way too. You talked about sort of what constitutes a liberal democracy. I'd like to just turn a little bit and ask, what are some of the main symptoms or criteria that start to constitute an illiberal advance? So when you're kind of zooming in on the sequencing of things, how does that look?
So again, that's a great question, and it also perhaps enables us to loop back to some of the to an earlier question that you asked, right? So sometimes you'll hear the term democracy used, electoral democracy sometimes, and liberal democracy. So why are those two terms used? Is it just that social scientists are being sloppy and they like jargon? Well, social scientists can be sloppy, they do like jargon, but here there's a reason for it, right? So liberalism, again, for maybe some of you can remember if you took political theory classes or whatever in college, right? Liberalism refers to something very specific, right? And in this context, what it means is all of those sort of liberal rights that you talk about when you are thinking about liberal theory, liberal thinkers, right? And in many ways, liberalism is a constraint on democracy. It says you can elect leaders in governments, but they can't do certain things, right? They're not allowed to take away the rights, certain rights of citizens, right? In the American context, we call them inalienable rights, right? We have a Bill of Rights precisely because our founding fathers were like, look, these are things actually that the government cannot do, right? They should not infringe on these things. We are taking these things, so to speak, out of the democratic process, out of the reach of majority rule, right? So freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of organization, all of these things, right? So liberalism is a place that is a set of rights, a set of liberties, if you want to think about it that way, that individuals have, right, that are not supposed to be subject to the electoral process, at least not directly, right? And so when we talk about a liberal democracy, we mean a country that doesn't only have free and fair elections, and that's a lot. Free and fair elections, the free and fair part is important, right? It means there's a real opposition. It means there's, at the very least, some freedom of the press, right? Because without those things, elections are, free and fair elections don't mean anything, right? But a liberal democracy is more than that, right? It's a democracy, it's a political system that respects, that nurtures all of these other things that we associate with liberalism. And so it is perfectly possible, and indeed many social scientists think about what's going on in places like the United States today, right, as an erosion first and foremost of some of those liberal values, right? A lack of respect for some of the things that liberalism is supposed to entail. So you would think of this as a democracy, but perhaps not a fully liberal one, which is why you often, as you said, hear the term illiberal democracy or illiberalism. And just to throw this out there, maybe to clarify a little bit, there's a reason why someone like Viktor Orban refers to his regime as illiberal, because he doesn't like liberal values, but he likes to think of himself as a popular leader, as a leader who reflects the will of his people.
Thank you. You referenced what's happening in the United States today, and I'd love to just follow up on that a little bit. In your opinion, does what's happening in the US, at least according to some people, does that threat stem more from the strengths of illiberal movements, or is it the weaknesses of liberal principles?
So I would say that, I mean, you could think of it in both ways. The way I would characterize it is we are living in a situation where people have sorted themselves into political parties that are much more homogenous in some ways, particularly on the Republican side, than they were in the past. And what do I mean by that? I mean that if you were to go back to the 70s or the post-war decades, you had two political parties that were composed of much more diverse coalitions than they are today. So you had religious folks in both parties. You had rural and urban folks in both parties. You even had conservatives and liberals in both parties, because of course, up through the post-war decades, you had conservative Southern Democrats, and you of course had liberal Republicans from the coasts and that kind of thing. And so the parties had profiles, but they were mixtures of people. And what's really happened over the last several decades is that has really changed, right? So, if you were to tell me I am a Caucasian person who is highly religious, living in a non-coastal area, and I consider myself conservative, I would be able to know that you are almost certainly a Republican. And that's not a normative judgment about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. It just means that our parties now, people who affiliate with, or who rather identify with parties, are much more homogenous. This is more true in the Republican side. The Democratic side is still a kind of coalition in the sense that you do have some voters who are conservative on some things, but they are minority voters. And so they are in the Democratic coalition just because of reasons, we could also discuss. Now, why is this problematic? Because it becomes much easier for the two parties to see themselves as entirely distinct. And indeed they are much more ideologically homogenous, as I said, people living in different areas. So when you look at those maps on presidential election day, I mean, you have coasts that are one color and much of the rest of the country that is not. And people have sorted themselves geographically. Again, if we look at housing patterns over the last several decades, people are much more likely to live in areas surrounded by people like themselves, interacting with people like themselves. And so we have really become, in that sense, a much more polarized country, with Republican and Democratic now meaning very different things. And when you see someone on the other side as really different from you, having few overlaps with you as far as, again, where you live, what your political ideology is, what your religious affiliation is, maybe even what your skin color is, it becomes very easy to see that person as not just your opponent, but as someone who is very threatening, who is potentially dangerous. And that becomes a very, very bad situation for democratic politics, small d, democratic politics.
Thank you. So we've talked a little bit about, we've touched on democratic backsliding, which is a term that just keeps cropping up. Are there any cases where we can see signs of authoritarian backsliding in the world today?
So that's a great question, actually, because one of the things that's happened at the same time as this undertow is we've had, I mean, obviously the pandemic was a little bit of a, well, not a little bit, but was a blip, but a huge rise in protests as well. So if you were to look at the last, I don't know, whatever, 5 years, one thing you would notice for sure is this undertow, absolutely. But the other thing you would notice if you were a social scientist who looked at these things is a huge explosion of protests, right? And those protests are everywhere, but they are disproportionately located in countries, precisely as you said, where authoritarians are either trying to become more authoritarian, or leaders, again, that were sort of in that gray category, are trying to crack down. So we have absolutely seen that. I mean, if you look at the newspaper, you see it in places ranging from Kazakhstan to, the United States, parts of Western Europe, against things that are seen as problematic from a democratic perspective. So absolutely also, in a more quotidian but perhaps more direct way, we have absolutely seen some leaders who are, worried about their positions, facing some real opposition. So two countries that I mentioned earlier, classic examples of electoral autocracy today, right? Turkey and Hungary, right? Orban is facing an election in April. For the first time in a very long time, despite a very uneven playing field, there is a chance he could lose that election. Turkey, too, we saw actually some very significant advances made by the opposition a year or so ago in those mayoral elections. Erdogan's party lost, for instance, the mayoralty of Istanbul. That's a big deal. He's now he's having a variety of problems because of economic mismanagement. We see protests, we see dissatisfaction. So absolutely, protests have been another very marked feature of our last several years. And again, they are disproportionately directed towards leaders who were seen as not being in line with popular aspirations.
Thank you so much, Sheri. I'm seeing a lot of fantastic questions in here, so I'm just going to jump right in. So the first question is, to what extent does the rise of illiberalism reflect the limitations of democratic systems to address the increasing complexity of challenges that require national global action consensus, such as climate change?
So it's a great question. I mean, and it actually provides a very good perspective, I think, on how to understand what's going on today, right? Which is, look, democracies, governments more generally, should be responsive to their citizens, right? And so, if you look around the world, in addition to seeing the rise of illiberalism, of populist movements in the United States and Western Europe, people are really dissatisfied. And whatever you think about their responses, right? You don't like the parties they vote for, you think they're nasty or, whatever. There's absolutely, dissatisfaction has a cause. Right? That is to say that if we look at the West in particular, we have seen things like rising economic inequality and insecurity, dramatic social, cultural, demographic changes. I mean, it is the job of leaders and governments to respond to change. I mean, that's, sort of one way of looking at democracy. We elect you, our leaders and our governments, to deal with our problems. And when leaders and governments are seen as not being responsive, right? Neither understanding nor coming up with solution to problems, dissatisfaction rises. This is straightforward. And people become when they're dissatisfied, they become willing to listen to a whole variety of things, maybe that they shouldn't. They become willing to vote for parties that are anti-establishment and perhaps even extremist. So, I mean, I think that is a very good thing for us to think about, right? Which is, this rising dissatisfaction is not exactly the same as a vote for an illiberal or a populist party, but it is certainly a precondition for that. And we are living in a world, I think, today that does have a very, very large number of problems. Again, social problems, cultural change, economic change, global challenges like, pandemics and climate change. And if you're looking around and the people that you voted for are not doing their job, yeah, you're going to see dissatisfaction with existing parties. You're going to see even dissatisfaction with democracy. So I absolutely think that that's a nice way to kind of get at some of the issues that we have been, grappling with, which is we are living in a time of significant change on many levels, and governments unfortunately seem to be over their heads in a lot of places.
Great, thank you. Probably last question. In what ways would the further weakening of democracy in the United States likely impact geopolitics and the stability of democratic values and institutions elsewhere around the globe?
So look, there's no doubt that the United States, as still the strongest democracy in the world, has a huge impact on the fate of democracy worldwide. It does that in different ways. One is, and really important, is through its example. Right? So there's simply no doubt that during the post-war era, when the United States was not only, the strongest democracy, but was economically successful, seemed, haltingly, but able to deal with some of its underlying social problems and inequities, that this was a positive thing for democracy worldwide, right? The democracy that was the most important one seemed to be flourishing to some degree. As the United States flounders and we look less attractive as a model, that is also important indirectly, because it enables non-democratic regimes to tout their own achievements, and it makes democracy look less attractive. But it matters directly, right? The weaker we are, the less likely we are to actively support democracy. And by that, I don't mean invading other countries. I mean being able to provide assistance, being able to provide advice that is taken, not as a sign of hypocrisy, right? But as a sign of strength. And so the weakening of the United States really does have a very important, both direct and indirect impact on the fate of democracy worldwide, which is why, we should all care about our own democracy if you're American, because this is the place where you live and our futures depend on it. But also, if you care about freedom in the world, a stronger United States is a positive force. Again, not necessarily, not in the sense of going out and conquering other countries, but in the sense of providing a model that, looks attractive to people who are struggling with repressive, unfree regimes of their own.
And that seems like a good place to stop. Sheri, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate just the depth that you went into with so many of these different questions. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us today on Global Insights. If you're looking for more in-depth analysis and want to be a part of our vibrant community, head over to network2020.org.